The last speaker today will be introduced by Mike Tomasello.
So thank you very much. I would second all the comments from other people about congratulations for 10 great years with this conference. I came to this first one, but I don't think I've come to any in between. I sent all my students from Leipzig every year. I have a whole crew of them. But I have, and the place is totally transformed with all this beautiful facilities and large group and all that. So great going, guys. Well, everyone who's been supervising students for a long time know that students come in all shapes and sizes, and some come needing a lot of shaping and forming and enculturating and teaching, and some come to you fully formed. So Hannes came to me pretty much fully formed, and so every student needs a different strategy, and my strategy with Hannes was pretty much get out of the way and don't get in his way. So he came already with an interest in theory of mind, false belief, which he had done his diploma thesis on, and he came to the Max Planck, and we did some things on pretense and did this great stuff on the normativity that any of you who have not seen Hannes give a talk but seen me give a talk on with all those cute videos on kids going 9, 9, das geht nicht. That's all his work and his studies that I get to benefit from. And now he's back still doing various things, but really concentrating on false belief and these replications of the implicit and explicit false beliefs, which I think we're going to hear about today. So Hannes, after he finished his PhD and postdoc at the Max Planck in Leipzig, he taught at the University of Leipzig and got his habilitation there, and then moved straight into a full professorship at the University of Göttingen, where he is now professor of developmental psychology and has built up a really great research group. I visited there with a lot of interesting people doing a lot of interesting things. So as other people have said, one of the greatest pleasures of, there are not many good things about getting older, but one of the pleasures of getting older is you get to see your students really doing new and unique things. So anyway, I give you Hannes Rakoczy.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much, Mike, for this very kind introduction, and thanks very much for the invitation to this great workshop. It's really a great honor to be here, and I'm not sure I've ever given a talk in front of an audience with such a frightening density of people I've been reading and admiring over the years. So this, on the one hand, makes me quite nervous. On the other hand, I thought I'm going to shamelessly make use of that opportunity and try out a couple of ideas on you in order to pick your brains. Given the time of the day and everyone's getting sleepy, and following Gergo's advice, I'll try to raise as much controversy as possible. So what I'll do is I'll talk about theory of mind, our conceptual framework with which we understand each other as persons, as agents, as rational agents with subjective perspectives on the world, the conceptual core of which is the ascription of propositional attitudes, such as beliefs, desires, and other subjective mental representational states. The conceptual core is thus a form of meta-representation, representing representational states in others and ourselves. In general form, a subject meta-represents that some other agent represents that P, and in paradigmatic form, since arguably beliefs are the most central propositional attitude, a subject believes that another agent believes that P. Throughout the talk, I'll use that scheme by marking the meta-representational attitude of our target subject in blue and the attitude of the agent whom she ascribes something to in red. Okay, so with this scheme at hand, subject meta-representation believes that another agent believes that P, I'll address three sets of questions. First, when and how, according to current evidence, does full-fledged, conceptually structured, explicit meta-representation emerge? Second, before and beside this full-fledged capacity, what would it mean if there was solid, robustly replicable evidence for an earlier, somehow analogous capacity that, however, reveals itself only in implicit tasks, for example, looking time tasks? And relatedly, what would it mean if there was solid evidence that this analogous capacity remains in operation throughout the lifespan, even in adults, in implicit, spontaneous, or otherwise indirect tasks? And I'll raise the second set of questions in the mode of a hypothetical conditional, not in the mode of a counterfactual conditional at this place, but in the form of a hypothetical conditional, in order to keep apart this conceptual and theoretical set of questions from the empirical question regarding the evidence itself, which will constitute the third question. Is there any such solid evidence? Okay, first question. When and how does full-fledged explicit meta-representation emerge? The traditional answer used to be, until a couple of years ago, as we've already heard from Agi this morning, that there's a conceptual revolution in the preschool ages, around age 4, such that children acquire the meta-representational conceptual framework of propositional attitudes at that time, building on more basic forms of social cognition already present in infancy, such as joint attention or a teleological stance, for example, and based on the development of language and executive function, other domain general capacities. The empirical basis for this picture comes from decades of research showing that there's highly systematic, synchronous, and correlated patterns of emerging competence in false belief and other conceptually related tasks that diverge massively in terms of superficial structure, topics, stimulus material, and so on and so forth, but that all converge conceptually in tapping the same capacity, understanding representation. And this performance pattern is intimately connected to the development of language and executive function, as we know from both correlational, cross-sectional, longitudinal, and training studies. Now, as you know, this traditional answer has come under attack from different directions, most prominently in recent years from the boosters, as it were, arguing that this picture underestimates early competence and may be based on false negative findings. And this is certainly the most discussed and the most prominent concern, and I'll turn to that in the second half of the talk. Much less noticed, but at least as serious, is the opposing concern from the scoffers, as it were, that this answer might actually overestimate competence and may be based on false positive findings. Such concerns have been raised and elaborated by many people, I think in most elegant and eloquent ways, recently by Tyler Burge in a huge paper in Psych Review 2018. I'll turn to two particular scoffer concerns. The first is, even if they pass false belief tests around age 4, children seem not to understand some essential properties of propositional attitudes, and thus they cannot be said to understand what beliefs, for example, are. In particular, they seem not to understand the aspectuality of propositional attitudes. What does that mean? That aspectuality refers to the fact that propositional attitudes always represent objects or states of affairs in subjective, perspectival, or spectral ways. They always represent under some description and not under others. And that's centrally relevant for what propositional attitudes are and our way of ascribing them. So here's a textbook example. Oedipus's beliefs about Jocasta. For example, Oedipus believes Jocasta would be the perfect lover for him. Jocasta, in fact, is his mother, but unbeknownst to him. So it doesn't follow, psychoanalysis notwithstanding, it doesn't follow that Oedipus believes his mother would be the perfect lover for him. I see disagreement by jury, but this is a logical point, not about one about psychoanalysis. So the point being, it matters how he represents Jocasta. He represents her under one description, Jocasta, and not under the other, his mother. And that's central to what propositional attitudes are and how we ascribe them. So when do children come to understand this central aspect of propositional attitudes? Now, research until quite recently suggested it's much later than the standard theory of mind age. For example, a study by Ian Apley and Liz Robinson, simple design. You've got two boxes, box 1 and box 2. You've got a paradigmatic rubber that's put into box 1. You've got a dice that's put into box 2. The dice is visibly a dice. It also has a rubber, but that it's a rubber is not visible. You can only find that out by using it. So there's a protagonist. The protagonist knows this is a rubber. The protagonist knows this is a dice, but the protagonist does not know that this is also a rubber. Test question, where will this protagonist look for a rubber? Correct answer, box 1, because he only represents that one as a rubber. This one is only represented by him as a dice. However, children find this very difficult and only pass this task from around 6 to 8 years of age. And in fact, they find it much more difficult than standard false belief tasks. In fact, performance aligns with higher order theory of mind tasks. Now, if that was correct, it would jeopardize the traditional answer because it would put into question the claim that children do understand what propositional attitudes are. But we were wondering whether this may be a false negative due to performance factors posed by tasks of this type, having to do with things like ambiguous referential terms and the corresponding reference resolution required. So rubber here refers to both objects, and the child has to engage in reference resolution. Which one does it refer to from the perspective of the protagonist? And we do know that reference resolution in and of itself is something quite complicated. So the task may be difficult because of this factor. So what we did, therefore, is we created a novel aspectuality task, structurally as analogous to standard force belief tasks as possible, with radically reduced performance factors. And this is how it goes. So it's a variation on a change of location force belief task, however, with an aspectual twist. So there are two locations. There's a protagonist witnessing the scene. And there's an object, a cognitive scientist in this case, who happens to have two identities or two attributes. The cognitive scientist also happens to be a Hungarian folk dancer. And this may or may not be known to the protagonist. And this is what happens. So a cognitive scientist goes to location 1. Folk dancer goes to location 2. And then the test question is, where will the protagonist watching look for the cognitive scientist? Now, it depends on who you ask. It depends on who the protagonist is. If the protagonist is someone reliable and knowledgeable, like another cognitive scientist, he'll, of course, know about the identity, and he'll know that the cognitive scientist is now in Vienna. If, however, the protagonist is someone unreliable, unknowledgeable, and ignorant, perhaps in general, and perhaps about Hungarian academia in particular, he'll be unaware of the identity and falsely believe that the cognitive scientist is still in location 1. So that's the basic logic. We did it slightly differently for kids, of course. Here's one way we did it with objects that have two functions, like the dice rubber. This is a pen that's visibly a pen, but it's also a rattle. But you can only find out it's a rattle by using it as a rattle. So in the presence of the protagonist, the pen is put into box 1. Then in the absence of the protagonist, it's shown that the pen is also a rattle. Protagonist comes back, and then the rattle is transferred as a rattle to box 2 in such a way that you can't see that it's the pen. And then the test question is, where will the protagonist look for the pen? Correct answer, box 1, because even though she has seen the object being moved, she saw it only under the description rattle and not under the description pen. And similarly with two identities of people, much like the cognitive scientist folk dancer. Okay, so here are the results from a set of studies. This is just one exemplary finding from one study. We tested 3 to 5-year-olds on these dual function, dual identity aspectual tasks. And what you see here is that these tasks are now not different in difficulty from standard first-order force belief tasks, and all of them are much easier than higher-order force belief tasks. And if you look at correlation patterns, these 3 types of tasks correlate and converge massively, both in raw and partial correlations, reinforcing the idea that they converge on tapping a common underlying core capacity, the ascription of aspectual propositional attitudes. So against this background, we can reject Scoffer concern 1 and turn to Scoffer's concern 2. 4-year-olds, the concern goes, might actually accidentally pass false belief tasks, not by using propositional attitude concepts, but by using simpler heuristics. And that they do so may be apparent and may be indicated in paradoxical performance patterns in other kinds of tasks, in particular in trivial control and baseline tasks like true belief control tasks. So true belief control tasks are just like false belief tasks, except that the agent doesn't ever acquire a false belief, witnesses or relevant events. They were originally invented, of course, to rule out that 3-year-olds fail false belief tasks because they find the task structure somehow too demanding. And so the original finding is 3-year-olds pass these tasks, and so you can rule out it's just something about the general narrative structure. But then there's anecdotal evidence that there's a really strange thing going on, that once they begin to pass false belief tasks, they begin to fail these trivial control tasks. And actually, there's 2 classes of accounts that predict such a pattern on theoretical grounds. 2, as it were, conceptual competence limitation accounts. One is, has been developed by Bill Fabricius and colleagues, arguing that children around this age operate with a simple heuristic. And it's called a perceptual access reasoning heuristic. Very simply, it goes like this. If an agent has had full perceptual access, she will act successfully, otherwise she will act unsuccessfully. Now, this heuristic would actually predict such a paradoxical performance pattern. Children from age 4 on pass false belief tasks, and failed true belief tasks in a special class of true belief tasks, in those tasks where at some point the agent has not had full perceptual access. Okay, so that's one kind of account. A second kind of account by Joseph Perrin and colleagues argues that the meta-representational, and in this case the mental file card architecture underlying propositional attitude description still changes radically in that time, and also predicts such a paradoxical performance pattern, passing false belief while failing true belief for children in this age range, in also some special class of cases, but different classes, namely so those tasks that have to do with aspectuality. This is a very elegant and very elaborated account, and unfortunately I don't have the time to go into the details of also its very precise formal derivations. So let me just point out how forceful this account is by mentioning who's been arguing for it. This is a very epic couple. This is Joseph, Mary. So what can you say about against such an account? Although it shouldn't go unmentioned that alternative accounts also have some higher support in this debate. Okay, so these are two conceptual limitation accounts that both predict such a pattern in special kinds of cases, but in different kinds of cases. We thought about an alternative explanation for this really weird finding in terms of pragmatic performance factors. So maybe children don't show this pattern because they suffer some conceptual limitations, but just because they find this task really strange. And if you think about it, it is a very, very strange task. It's a completely trivial task. You tell them a story about an agent who's basically witnessed all relevant events, and then you ask them, what will the agent think or believe or do? So this may be confusing because it integrates a number of strange factors. It's a trivial scenario, it's an academic test question, and you ask that test question about a rational agent's perspective. Now, normally we ask about a rational agent's perspective with a pragmatic point, when there's at least a possibility of misrepresentation. So imagine out of the blue in the middle of the talk I do the following. By the way, there's a question I wanted to ask you. What will Gergo think this is? You'll be confused. I mean, why is he asking that? Is Gergo short-sighted? Is that not a class? Is this a class in epistemology? What's the point of it? So this is, That's why it works. And that's the idea. So this is all a pragmatically confusing scenario. And this alternative account predicts a number of things, two things. First of all, you should find a paradoxical performance pattern in all kinds of true and false belief tasks, not just the one class or the other class. And second, it could be alleviated, it could be made to go away if you modify the pragmatic task structure. So we tested the first prediction in the following way. We tested children on standard false and true belief tasks, on aspectual false and true belief tasks. And now remember, the one kind of account competence limitation account would predict the pattern here, the other account would predict it here, and the alternative pragmatic account would predict it everywhere. And the difference between true and false belief tasks is just whether the agent witnesses or doesn't witness the relevant events. And here are the results. So we tested kids from 3 to 10 and adults in order to validate the task. And you see first the standard false and true belief tasks, true belief in dark bars, and the gray bars are false belief. So the 3-year-olds perform as they should, above chance in true belief, below chance in false belief, and the adults perform as they should, add ceiling in both. But in between, you see this very interesting pattern. False belief, again, as they should. Children perform above chance from around age 4. But in true belief, you see this massive U-shaped curve between 3, such that only at 3 and 10, such that only at 10, children start to perform competently in both kinds of tasks. And we see the very same pattern for the other kind of tasks, the aspectuality tasks. Now, regarding the relations between true and false belief tasks, we see massive negative correlations, both raw and partial, for both kinds of tasks, reinforcing the idea that the more advanced they become in theory of mind, as indicated by their false belief task performance, and thus the more pragmatically sensitive, the more they get confused about the strange pragmatics. So that bears out the first prediction. What about the second one, that this pattern can be alleviated by modifying the pragmatic task structure? We got at this in a number of ways. I'll just show you one. What we did is we made the task more complex, actually, but thereby pragmatically less confusing. rather than having one type of task, which is a true belief task, and another type of task that's a false belief task, we added two agents in the scenario. One agent who ended up having a true belief, and the other agent who ended up having a false belief. And then we asked about both of them. What will she and what will he think, or where will they look for the object? This makes the task more complicated. There's more to remember, but it makes it pragmatically less confusing, because asking about this agent's true belief now has a pragmatic point, because there is the possibility of misrepresentation by the contrast to the false belief agent. And again, we did this for standard and the spectral false belief and true belief tasks. And here are the results. So we see the standard task here and the spectrality task there. The 3-year-olds, again, perform as they should. So this is the true belief task, above chance. This is the false belief task, not different from chance. And this is aggregate score. Would they, in a given trial, answer both false and true belief questions correctly? So children at 3, both in standard and the spectral, as to be expected. But now the 4- and 6-year-olds look very differently. They perform above chance in both true, false belief, true belief, and the aggregate score at 4 and 6 for both kinds of tasks. And the previously negative correlations turn into substantial positive correlations, both raw and partial. And this, we think, bears out the second prediction by showing that these pragmatic performance factors can be removed and then the pattern goes away. So in response to these two scoffer concerns, we can then reject them, and actually by rejecting them on these new empirical grounds, we can corroborate the traditional answer, which suggests that the conceptual revolution we see around 4 is even more coherent than previously assumed, indicating the emergence of the framework of a spectral propositional attitudes. What about then the opposing concern by the boosters? And this then leads us to the second set of questions. Before and beside this full-fledged capacity, what would it mean if there was solid evidence for an earlier, somehow analogous capacity that reveals itself only in implicit tasks such as looking time tasks? So what such tasks, violation of expectation or anticipatory looking tasks, for example, would minimally show is that the infant is in some way representationally sensitive to some belief that P involving situation of an agent. Now, this very artificial way of expressing it is a consequence of, at this point, trying to be as minimalist and as neutral as possible. But this minimal interpretation, does this amount to showing that the infant has meta-representational beliefs about another agent's beliefs that P? This actually incorporates two sub-questions. Does the infant have meta-representational beliefs rather than some simpler representational states about another agent's beliefs rather than some simpler states? Now, early competence, and in particular nativist accounts, would, I think, answer these two sub-questions affirmatively, that infants have meta-representational beliefs about other agents' beliefs, as indicated, for example, by these more or less randomly sampled quotes from influential papers, such that 18-month-olds understand false beliefs, or infants' reasoning about false beliefs is highly context-sensitive, or this one, which I think is the most informative. Contrary to traditional claims, the ability to attribute false beliefs to others is already present by the second year of life. This is the most informative because it shows three things. We assume the infant have meta-representational beliefs about others' false beliefs, and this actually is the very same capacity that we examine in looking at the Fourier revolution, and thus it actually contradicts traditional claims. Now, the underlying picture here is roughly the following. There's a conceptual core competence that's intact early on, possibly innate, and that remains qualitatively more or less unchanged. Development does happen, but it merely consists in the growth of additional extraneous machinery that helps overcome performance limitations. This becomes most clear in the debate about the well-established relations between theory of mind performance and executive function. Here, these accounts would assign to executive function a merely expressive role. So executive function helps to express this otherwise unchanged capacity in a certain type of task. And this contrasts with other accounts that would ascribe to executive function a much more substantial role, not just in the expression, but in the emergence of a new capacity. And similarly, regarding the role of language, where language here has a merely expressive role over development, in contrast to other accounts that would assign to language a much more substantial role in the emergence and constitution of theory of mind. Now, schematically, we can depict it as follows. There's a conceptual core capacity that's intact early on. Over time, it may grow relations to extraneous factors, executive function, language, and so on and so forth. But these are extraneous relations. They don't enter into the very same capacity. The capacity remains unchanged and merely gets expressed in new ways. And that's, I think, the way that in this tradition, the term implicit theory of mind is understood. It's the very same capacity, but it's implicit in the sense that it doesn't yet get expressed in certain types of tasks. Now, this picture, of course, has been most elegantly and elaborately developed and defended by Alan Leslie over the years. That isn't exactly Alan Leslie. That's almost Alan Leslie. This is Alan Leslie. This is Dustin Hoffman, by the way. And this is taken from a fantastic look-alike board of cognitive scientists and other famous people that's run at the University of Birmingham. So the University of Birmingham doesn't only have a really great cognitive development unit run by Sarah Beck, Ian Apley, and others, but also this fantastic look-alike board. So I can very much recommend visiting Birmingham both for scientific and for humoristic reasons. Okay, so this is I think the picture underlying here. Which I'd now like to challenge. So what I'd like to argue is that the inference from this, so if there was solid evidence, it would show representational sensitivity in the infants to some belief that p-involving situation. The inference from this to the infant has full-fledged meta-representational beliefs about another agent's beliefs, may be a premature conclusion, may involve a huge inferential gap, and may neglect the space of possibilities regarding the individuation and characterization of different kinds of representational states that's much larger than is often appreciated in these kinds of debates. So turning to the first sub-question, would such solid evidence show that the infants have meta-representational beliefs? Well, not necessarily. So these kinds of representational sensitivities you would tap with these kinds of tasks, with these very limited looking time tasks, for example, would certainly show information in the system, as it were. But one starting intuition, this is quite different from information represented for the system or information to the system, as some philosophers would call it, information that's available at the personal level. Now, what's that supposed to mean? Here is a much-quoted passage from the philosopher Gareth Evans, who tries to make that point in discussing the question how perceptual experience at the personal level is related to information processing, say, in the visual system. He says, we arrive at conscious perceptual experience when sensory input is not only connected to behavioral dispositions, but also serves as the input to a thinking, concept applying, and reasoning system, so that the subject's thoughts, plans, and deliberations are also systematically dependent on the informational properties of the input. When there is such a further link, we can say that the person, rather than just some part of his brain, receives and processes the information. So there's many attempts to explicate these underlying differences by distinguishing, for example, personal versus subpersonal levels of description. And one distinction I want to make use of in the following between propositional attitudes proper versus more simple representational states called subdoxastic states. So this distinction was introduced by Steve Stitch, Martin Davies, and other philosophers to distinguish the mental states that we posit in cognitive science at different subpersonal or neural levels from our full-fledged psychological propositional attitudes we ascribe at the personal level. One example is we've got many representational states in us that track duration, say, for example, in visual or auditory perception. In auditory perception, we track things like voice onset time and speech perception, duration tracking representational states. But that's very, very different from the beliefs I have at the personal level about duration, such as I've got only 20 minutes left. What are the differences? Well, three central differences are propositional attitudes are inferentially integrated with other states at the personal level. They're conceptualized and thus have a certain level of generality, systematicity, and compositionality. And they're at least in principle accessible to consciousness, and that means they're available for rational action planning, deliberation, and so on and so forth, as indicated in the Gareth Evans quote. So the basic idea is propositional attitudes have a much richer functional profile than these simpler representational states. And with this at hand, we can contrast this schematic picture of early competence or nativist accounts with the different alternatives. We can say, well, early on, it may be the case that there is a minimal a representational state intact that has certain input relations, tracks some belief that p-involving situation, and certain output guidance by, for example, influencing looking behavior. But that's a far fetch from the much more complicated functional roles that grow over time: inferential integration with other states, conceptualization, playing roles in deliberation and action planning, and so on and so forth. And reverting to a distinction in the literature around functionalism, what we could say is this state, which is present early on, may be a core realizer of the capacity in this case, a theory of mind. But it only becomes so over time by getting functionally integrated with other states. And at that time, we can say that the state, in its context, in its functional relation to other states, constitutes the total realizer of this capacity. So to illustrate this difference, take one of philosophers' favorite toy examples in the philosophy of mind. Let's assume a certain mental state, say pain, is realized by a certain neural type of state, say C-fiber firing. Then we could say that C-fiber firing is the core realizer of this mental state, pain. But clearly, that C-fiber firing in and of itself is not enough. Take the C-fiber out of the body and have it fire in the test tube, there'll be no pain. Why not? Well, because C-fiber firing only in the context of its functional relation in the system, in the context of a total realizer, constitutes that capacity. So with this alternative picture at hand, we can see the following consequences for describing development. We can talk about substantial qualitative changes from infancy to early childhood in terms of transitions from subdoxastic representational states to full-fledged propositional attitudes, for example. This may be described by metaphors such as representational redescription, and it is compatible with both conceptual change accounts and with at least model dual process frameworks, which assume that these processes intact early on may be qualitatively different, but get a basis for those we see later on. It also has implications such that we can talk about emergence and constitution of new capacities rather than new expression of old capacities. And this is also interesting implications, for example, for describing neurocognitive development. If, for example, we see that early on in infancy, core regions of theory of mind are already in operation, say the temporal-parietal junction, this does not mean that the very same cognitive processes are already in operation. It may mean that the core realizer of what then turns out to be the general capacity are already in operation, but only over development do they come functionally integrated to thus constitute total realizers of these new capacities. And there's actually recent evidence that may be compatible with that, such that what happens around 4 years of age is the functional integration at the neural level between these core areas and more central areas, for example. So I think with this at hand, we can say that if there was solid evidence from these implicit tasks, it wouldn't necessarily show that the infants have full meta-representational beliefs. It would certainly show they have some representational capacities, but these may be simpler in nature than full meta-representational beliefs. What about the second sub-question? What do they ascribe, if anything, to others? Are those beliefs, or rather than some simpler states? This is a question that has received more attention in the recent debates, and many simpler alternatives have been put forward. So it has been said by dual process accounts, for example, that infants may just track belief-like states in Apperly and Butterfield's case, or experiential records in the case of Josef Perner's and Johannes Rösler account, awareness relation in Laurie Santos's account, and so on and so forth. Now, all of these have in common that they grant that something is ascribed by the infant to others, but something that may be simpler than full-fledged beliefs. And then how do you decide between these simple alternatives and the early competence accounts? Well, you have to derive competing predictions from the two accounts regarding the generality of these capacities and potential signature limits. So all of these accounts propose signature limits when it comes to aspectuality, what we've talked about before, such that the infant couldn't fully understand aspectual propositional states in others. The empirical state of the art is very complicated. Most findings from implicit tasks remain simply neutral vis-a-vis these two, the more rich and the leaner alternatives, because they're equally compatible with both of them. But there have been some studies with more decisive and diagnostic tasks, and the evidence is very complicated and mixed. Some do find evidence for, whereas others fail to find evidence for such signature limits. Okay, so this leads us to the conclusion of the second set of questions. If there was solid evidence from such implicit tasks, what would it mean? Would it show that infants have meta-representational beliefs about others' beliefs? And I've tried to argue that, no, it wouldn't show that. It would show representational sensitivity towards some representational states in others, but this may be much simpler than full-fledged beliefs about beliefs. And the last question finally then, is there such solid evidence? Evidence from implicit measures. This roughly spans different types of measures: looking time, violation of expectation studies, anticipatory looking studies, priming or allocentric bias studies, and interaction studies. Interaction studies using interaction are, I think, a little bit different from those in the sense that they are intuitively less implicit than the other ones, in the sense that they go into feeding into action planning and deliberation. So this is a question I don't have time to discuss, but we may come back to this later on. These, I would say, are intuitively clearer cases of implicit tasks, in the sense of that they don't feed into rational action planning and deliberation. So as you may be aware, the situation here is the following. So in a very short tabloid kind of Marxist summary, it looks like this. There was a traditional picture followed by a revolution from 2005 on from these implicit tasks, followed by a crisis from roughly 2015 on regarding the replicability of these findings. The crisis, I should say, many of us stumbled into this, so there was never any prior intention to systematically test the replicability or to even doubt the replicability of these measures. I think everyone just took for granted that these are robust findings and then tried to capitalize on them in order to develop them further, to test signature limits, for example, and to tap the underlying cognitive processes. But then many of us got stuck in the first step by being unable to replicate these basic findings. So in the following, I'll just give you a very brief and incomplete overview in order to give you a feel for the current situation. I'll briefly mention priming and allocentric bias, briefly mention violation expectation, talk a little bit more about interaction, and then focus most on anticipatory looking, because that's where we have by far the biggest empirical database today. So priming allocentric bias, one of the most influential tasks has been this so-called dot perspective task by Donna, Sampson. The basic finding was, if you as a subject are asked to count the number of dots here, and there happens to be a completely irrelevant agent in the scene, you are slower and more error-prone if your perspective diverges from the perspective of this agent. So in this case, where the agent can see 2 and you have to count 3, you're slower and more error-prone compared to a situation where your perspectives align. Many studies have now thrown some doubts regarding the replicability of these basic findings, and other studies have managed to replicate the basic findings, but raised doubts about the validity of this finding in terms of spontaneous perspective taking. For example, a set of studies by Cole et al., what they did is they manipulated whether the window through which an agent saw was opaque versus transparent or was completely blocked. Other studies used goggles and manipulated whether the goggles were transparent or opaque. Now, if it's about perspective taking, this should make a fundamental difference. So if it's about perspective taking, the effect should only be visible in cases where the agent actually can see something, but not in which the agent is unable to see. But these studies didn't find any difference between opaque and transparent conditions, and thus raised doubts about the interpretation of this finding in terms of perspective taking. Regarding looking time and violation of expectation studies, the situation is also very complicated. The original positive findings do come from very few labs. In addition, are difficult to interpret given lack of methodological consistency across these studies in things such as end of trial or inclusion criteria, an argument that Paula Rubio Fernandez has recently made in a very nice paper. And there are some independent replications attempts, several of them published, others unpublished, that fail to find the basic effects. For example, studies from Diane Pauline-Dubois' lab, from Susan Carey and Rebecca Sachs's lab, and also from Ulf Duskovsky's and our lab. But the situation is, I think, much in need of clarification here because we don't have that many systematic replication attempts here as in other areas. Let's briefly turn to interaction, and I'll describe a set of studies that we did, again, Ulf Liskowski's in our lab in collaboration. We focused on one interaction task, the so-called Cfo Task, which is a very straightforward task. We've got two boxes, box 1 and box 2. Object A is put into box 1, object B is put into box 2. This is witnessed by the protagonist. The objects are swapped, and this is either witnessed in the true belief condition or not witnessed in the false belief condition. And then the agent points to one box and says, give me the Cfo. Original finding was that infants gave this object in the true belief condition, but that object in the false belief condition, supposedly tracking the true or false belief of the agent. This is a great task because it's clearest in terms of interpretation and face validity of the interactive tasks that are out there. And it also is based on analogous explicit tasks that had been done before, so we can contrast that with the performance pattern we know older children show in explicit versions of that task. So in a series of several studies, 6 studies that Ulf and our labs did together, we tested children from 17 months, which is the original age group, to 48 months, and also adults. And the main results were that there was no evidence for belief tracking in any age group of children, so no differentiation between true and false belief conditions in any age group of children. Generally, children tended to just give the indicated object from that box in all condition indifferently. And even the 4-year-olds performed less proficiently in this Cfo task compared to an explicit false belief task. Now, this may seem surprising on first sight, but I think on second sight, it's not that surprising because it's a really complicated task in terms of the inhibitory demands. So in the false belief condition, the agent points to this box, and the correct response is to go to the other box. So you have to inhibit following the point of the agent. And we know from many other studies, for example, from Vikram Jaswal's lab, that this is a difficult thing to do in and of itself. And also this fits nicely with what Olivier mentioned today in the talk today. You basically have to overcome your naive trust in what the agent is indicating. And only in adults did we find that they performed as competently in an adapted Cfo version as in an explicit task. These findings do align with other published and unpublished replication attempts, but I should also mention that there are positive recent replication attempts from Ildikó and others here in Budapest. Finally, let's turn to anticipatory looking, because I think we have the very clearest and biggest database there. It's been the kind of task that has been most widely used across the lifespan. So it can be used with all age groups. It has been used across species, so it's also a task that has been used with non-human primates, and it has been used across typical and atypical conditions, for example, along the whole spectrum of autism. It's also most suitable for direct replications because it can be run in completely automated procedure and analysis, so you can really directly replicate it, put it on your machine, and do the very same thing. So what we did in our lab is we took a number of these tasks, the original Southgate and Senju task, a task by Jason Lowe and colleagues, by Donna Schneider and colleagues, by Lukas Zurian and colleagues, and administered these tasks to a big battery of participants. In a number of studies, we tested children of varying ages and adults, more than 1,500 overall, which to our knowledge is the so far biggest systematic replication attempt. These were all initially direct replications with the original stimulus material and methods. And the main results were the following. Individual studies could largely not be replicated. There were 2 exceptions. The one condition of Vicky's 2007 study, the FB1 condition, but this condition by itself remains inconclusive because it's equally compatible with belief tracking and with simple explanations in terms of just tracking where the object in this case, was last. Second exception was one condition from the Lowe and Watt study. Upon closer inspection, it turned out this condition had a confound with the familiarization, which may have created a side bias, which turned out to be the same side which you'd have to answer correctly in the test trial. Once we removed that side bias, the effect went away. And across studies, there was no evidence of convergence or correlation between the tasks, although these tasks are all superficially very similar anticipatory looking tasks, much in contrast to the strong correlations we see in explicit tasks, even though they are very different in terms of superficial features. So in follow-up studies, we then tried to whether we could find the effect with some manipulations. We manipulated, for example, the relevance and the salience of the stimulus material inspired by this study by Chris Krupeni and colleagues on non-human primates with very relevant and salient stimulus material, people in gorilla costumes. We also varied linguistic elements in the scenario and the instruction. And again, the results were frustrating. There was no effect of stimulus material. We couldn't find any effect in any conditions, except there was evidence for robust belief-based anticipatory looking in one conditions, and that was in adults after we explicitly instructed them, when we told them, look to where the agent will believe the thing is or where she will search for it. Then we found the effect. But this, of course, then is not an implicit effect. We transformed it into an explicit task. So the conclusion is currently there is no solid, it seems there is no solid, robustly replicable evidence from implicit tasks for early meta-representational theory of mind in infants or spontaneous meta-representational theory of mind in adults. But the main open question, of course, is this is all absence of evidence. What about evidence of absence? So perhaps we have just not found the right kinds of measures yet to tap these capacities. And this central question is currently being addressed in Many Babies 2. Many Babies 2 is a sort of international collaborative research consortium dedicated to testing the reliability and validity of these implicit theory of mind measures. It all started a couple of years ago when Agi and I at a workshop were discussing issues of replicability of these measures, and thought it would be a great idea to get everyone involved around a round table and discuss these issues. And we were very lucky that this actually materialized. So in the course of this initiation, we actually got everyone from the field together, authors of original studies, authors of replication studies, people from very, very different theoretical backgrounds, so that we are now a consortium of several dozen people and several labs, incorporating and embodying what Ralf Hertwig and Daniel Kahneman a couple of years termed adversarial collaboration with people from very different theoretical backgrounds that get together to agree upon what would be a good test for a given capacity, what would be a good test to distinguish between competing predictions made from different theoretical backgrounds. So this is a really great initiative. It's currently coordinated by Toby Schuberg from Munich, Dora Campis from Copenhagen, formerly Budapest, Mike Frank from Stanford, and myself. And the plan is to run a couple of waves of big projects corresponding to these different measures. And we're currently starting with anticipatory looking for the reasons that I've just mentioned. It's the most usable method across different age groups, across the lifespan. It's best for direct replication because you can directly implement it in consistent ways across labs. So we're currently in the piloting stage. We are running a couple of pilots to validate that this stimulus material basically is suitable for young kids. And then hopefully in the course of the spring or summer, we're going to be ready to start the first study. And this is my little propaganda speech. At this point, we're going to issue an open call and invite labs to participate. And the basic idea is that as many labs as possible worldwide contribute a small number of infants so that pooling these resources, we really get in total a massive sample to conclusively test these questions. Okay, so to wrap up, I've addressed 3 sets of questions. When and how, according to current evidence, does full-fledged conceptually structured meta-representation emerge? I think the traditional answer that there's a conceptual transition or revolution going on in the preschool age can be defended against recent scoffer concerns, and it can even be corroborated. There's new evidence that this conceptual transition is even more coherent than previously assumed. It marks the emergence of the framework of a spectral propositional attitude concepts. So it emerges at the latest around age 4. What about potential earlier emergence beside and before this full-fledged capacity? What would it mean if there was solid evidence for an earlier, somehow analogous capacity that, however, reveals itself only in implicit tasks? I've tried to argue that if there was such solid evidence, it would show remarking representational capacities, but not necessarily full-fledged meta-representational beliefs about other people's beliefs. And thus 1 and 2 together leave much more room for substantial cognitive development from infancy to early childhood and is compatible, for example, with conceptual change and moderate dual process accounts. And finally, is there such evidence? Currently, we don't know. Hopefully, many babies too will find out. And so thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to all of these collaborators whose work I've been talking about.
Thank you, Hannes. Great talk. And before the replication issue takes over the discussion as it might, let me raise a more general issue, which you framed quite well by the quote you gave from Gareth Evans, and the notion that you defended, which is, if you think about it, by no means self-evident. In fact, I find it weird that what we're aiming at is describing a personal level mechanism. That fear of mind or attribution mental state is taking place there, and if we find all things, we're not finding it. Quite generally speaking, what's been happening with the development of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience now is we are all working on subpersonal psychology. That's where the action is. And the fact that there are indeed personal phenomena has become a problem rather than the locus at which we do psychology. If you think that really, let me just add. So when Gareth Evans said, "Oh, the personal level is when you integrate planning, reasoning," this is certainly today. No, I mean, very few people would argue any such thing. All work on action planning, on inference, on reasoning, and so on, is at a subpersonal level, doesn't assume any kind of personal integration. The personal level seems to come typically after. So I'm not quite, you seem to restrict the topic of theory of mind to something which is fairly marginal to cognitive, the study of cognitive development and cognitive psychology. That's probably not what you want.
No, well, I wish you it was true what you said. If it was true what you said, then, for example, these kinds of quotes wouldn't make much sense. Because clearly what we're talking about here in traditional claims are personal level capacities. Personal level capacities where children can talk, action plan, and reason about these kinds of things. So I would totally agree that what we're describing in infancy would be subpersonal mechanisms. But then there's no contrary to traditional claims, and that's in fact what I've been trying to argue. So, and you can call it inference 1 and inference 2, or you can call it intuitive or reflective beliefs. Just to take a random example.
Psychology as opposed to all philosophical psychology.
Pardon?
I can call it cognitive psychology as opposed to all philosophical psychology.
Well, but I would disagree that cognitive psychology only deals in subpersonal machinery. I mean, clearly what we're talking about here with these conceptually structured capacities, that's not subpersonal.
It doesn't only deal in subpersonal, but the personal level, rather than being the level at which things happen, it becomes something to be explained in terms of subpersonal mechanisms.
That's totally. I wouldn't disagree in any way. So actually, what I've tried to say is, what we're describing in the traditional picture is a personal level capacity. And what we're describing early on may be something more basic, so that there is no contrary. It's not nothing, what we find early on. It's the building blocks, and that's the idea of these early capacities may be the core realizers that turn out to be the total part of the total realizers over development. So I think this is perfectly compatible with what you're saying. And it's not the case that I only want to talk about the personal level. I want to talk about the personal level and these capacities that we've traditionally been researching with certain types of methods and how they relate to potential simpler subdoxastic, subpersonal things going on earlier.
Joseph.
Okay. Yeah. You painted a beautifully coherent picture, so I hate what I have to say. But I have to say it.
It's all about control.
Okay, so my main bone of contentions is what you had to say about the aspectuality task. In our study, where we found that when you, in your terminology, we had the true belief version of your version of the aspectuality task, and we suddenly found an error. And you try to explain this, that this is this general tendency to give wrong answers to true belief questions. One problem with this is that we also had another false belief and true belief, and that is it's one where you just said it's, what was it, the pen that is a rattle or something? Okay, so that you only say the pen rattles, and otherwise it's pretty much the same. And then children don't show this problem. But the true belief condition there is a true belief condition as you have it, but they didn't have the problem. So it seems to us it's very unlikely that the problem they had when the pen is a rattle could be due to being a true belief condition. Okay, now you could say, well, but you find that with similar material, that you still get, even in the aspectuality thing, you don't get the error if you have the two characters, okay? But then you create another strategy, which is very plausible, that if you have two characters contrasting, one got it all, the other one didn't, that the one who got it all gives the correct answer, and the other one doesn't. So that would be an alternative explanation for those particular results. And then one more point, we also did the traditional Apley-Robinson manipulation, and it turns out that you get and your explanation was that this is due to the complexity of the rubber that is also a dye and then a regular rubber, and you get sort of ambiguous reference. But we found that replicate Apley and Robinson's difficulty, but it only depends on, first of all, when the child gets to know that it is a rubber and a dye, and that doesn't really, then the difficulty disappears if you get to know it later, which doesn't seem to be easily interpretable with that it's less confusing. And the other thing is, if you do it verbally, then it also disappears. So here are some holes in your otherwise very nice picture.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly there are some subtle complexities about the empirical findings, but the two sets of findings together, that you find the same patterns for spectral and non-spectral tasks, and the pattern goes away when you make the task more complex and thus pragmatically less confusing in this study with the two protagonists, and they're very good. So if they just sort of guessed on the first trial and then took something different on the second trial, they're still above that level that you would expect by such a pattern here. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are some questions to be worked out on which conditions exactly they do and don't pass these kinds of tasks. But these two kinds of findings together seem to me to suggest there is at least a basic capacity there.
Okay, Donna.
Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned what would be the consequence if there was evidence for a system early on that is like the later system, essentially for implicit theory of mind, what the consequence would be and whether we have the evidence. But what would be the consequence if we don't find the evidence? And especially in light of the fact that actually most of the so-called non-rich early accounts would also predict replicability, whether it's associations or any of the early accounts. Yeah,
nihilism would follow. No, no. I mean, seriously, as I said, I mean, we started this this research in the hope of finding evidence or testing for evidence for predictions made by sort of intermediate dual process accounts. And so in a sense, I mean, there's three kinds of classes of theories that have been put forward to explain the implicit findings, sort of rich, intermediate, and nihilist. By nihilist, I mean submentalizing very lean interpretations in terms of, like Celia Hayes's. And I'm not sure what these findings mean, but I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind this only refers to a very limited class of tasks from looking time studies and so on and so forth. We have rich evidence from other more interactive tasks of joint attention, for example, or perspective taking, that I think seem much more robust, that go outside of this box, that do indicate early capacities of some kind. So it may be, I mean, with the anticipatory looking, for example, it may be, given that in our lab, for example, the only robust evidence we find is after we explicitly instruct them. This is, or at least in the current form of tasks we have, this is not a very sensitive measure to tap the kind of processes we are interested in. So this would be nihilist from a methodological point of view, but not from a cognitive point of view. It wouldn't suggest there isn't any capacities. It would suggest we have to get at them in different ways.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I have a question which somewhat is similar, but from the other side of what Dan asked, and is the following. When you were making your argument for the lack of evidence for forgetting about the replicability story, the lack of evidence for theory of mind pre-4 years, I was thinking about what you were saying, and I was thinking, okay, essentially we were saying, even if there were information in the system, that doesn't mean that it's available for the system. Okay. And I was thinking, okay, but that's the question. How far do you want to push this argument? Because if I think about this argument, that's sort of what it applies to every kind of evidence that the people have found about early cognitive capacities. So the question I have is, can you mention one case in which exists, in which you would be happy to say, well, you know, this passes my kind of criterion? Or do you really think that what you're saying applies to everybody?
That's a very good question. So in fact, I mean, this you're completely right. This is a general point that applies to implicit measures in general. It applies to looking time measures in all areas. And as I said, interactive measures, I think, have an interesting intermediate stage in the sense that they get towards the direction of rational action planning and deliberation. Now, it's an interesting question how these two kinds of measures relate in different areas to each other. And in most, and so here's one thing. In most areas, they dissociate considerably. So in physical cognition, for example, if you look at the beautiful work by Sukkari and Bruce Hood, for example, you get these dissociation between looking time measures and active measures of searching for objects according to gravity and things like that. So where a few months old kid would show sensitivity in a looking time version, but when they have to do an active version of that, it only comes years later. So that would be compatible with a similar story. You find sort of conceptual or cognitive development from information that's in the system and that gets over time available for functional integration. Now, an interesting question is, are there areas where this is not the case? And I've been wondering for a couple of years about object individuation, because object individuation, social object individuation, is the only area I can think of where there's no such dissociation. So the classical shoe and carry, and then the subsequent manual reaching methods used by many people in the room here, and we've adapted them for use with non-human primates, they converge completely in the age of emergence. So is that a coincidence, or is there something interesting to the effect that social object individuation in and of itself is not something that you only can get at the subpersonal level? I have no idea, but this is just a phenomenon that has puzzled me, that kept me puzzling for a couple of years, and perhaps you've got good intuitions why that is so.
Okay, so the last question from Charlotte.
Yes, some of the questions have already actually been mentioned, but just to follow up on the question of the replication of those paradigms. So you were pointing out that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? And I think that's something I'm missing in that debate a little bit, like all the time, basically, also in the many babies debate, and I would just like to maybe invite people to think a little bit more about how can we actually think about finding like something that would be decisive, like not just absence of evidence. And so the results there also that you showed looked like, or from your replication studies, looked like a very coherent picture. And here again, I would also like to invite you to think a little bit about some patterns that are actually being, as I feel in the data that, or in the non-replications as well, that seem to replicate actually. So those might not be the full pattern as we think about them, but so for example, something that most of the studies, the non-replication studies have found is a difference between false belief and true belief conditions. They haven't found that children look to the correct location in the false belief above chance, but they found a modulation. Similarly, in the false belief 1 compared to false belief 2 condition, in the other paradigm that you mentioned, that was originally by Vicky Southgate, there are also, most studies actually didn't analyze that, but in the pattern, the data pattern, it mostly looks as if they were looking in a differential way to the first and the last location. So this would not only be explained by the strategy that you were suggesting. And I think, so I'm not arguing for that we have evidence that these things replicate robustly, but I think that in the current debate, people oversee these patterns that are there, and I think they could help us to find out what is there and what is not. And yeah, that's just...
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's a great point. I mean, just a tiny answer. So in our replication, we don't find true belief, false belief differences. That's what we look for in the Schneider and so on studies, and we don't find them. The bigger point I think is well taken, that replications, these kinds of replication projects shouldn't just be doing the same thing over and over again, but sort of it may be a first step to do direct and conceptual replication, but then that's what I meant by the great opportunity of this being adversarial collaboration. Despite different theoretical backgrounds, people should sit together and agree upon what would be a decisive and crucial test case, and in addition, one that allows you to tease apart competing predictions from different accounts. So replication research in this area, or in all areas, shouldn't just be reproducing something, but moving the field one step forward, hopefully.
Okay, thank you, Hannes.
Thank you.